What's up, music lovers? Thank you for clicking on my channel, and today I'll be ranking every single album by the band Death. One of the most important metal bands because not only did they invent death metal, although some people might argue they didn't, but they also came to reinvent it and push it into new levels of technicality. As their albums went on, they just got more and more musical, and with that in mind, I just want to say that I think every single one of these albums is good, so I might have some eras of the band that I like a bit more, and if we disagree, that's totally fine. I hope you disagree with me. Just, let me know in the comments, and don't be a dick about it. Before we get into it, if you like hard rock, heavy metal, progressive rock, any kind of music in general that's really guitar driven, please go ahead, subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, leave a comment. All those YouTube cliches, it really does help the channel grow, so thank you in advance for that. So with all that preamble out of the way, let's just get into it and start talking about some Death. Okay, and coming up first is their debut album from May 1987, Scream Bloody Gore. Probably the first death metal album, and Chuck plays all the guitars, the bass, he's singing on it. The only person on this album that's not Chuck is Chris Reinfurt on drums, and he's done a billion different things. I'm going to go ahead and put it in B tier. I love this album, and the fact that Chuck was a teenager when he wrote most of this stuff is insane to me. Add in the fact that he was, 19 or 20 when he was recording this, and the quality in his performance on guitar and his vocal deliveries and just how professional he sounds at such a young age, and the fact that he invented this whole subgenre pretty much is all absolutely crazy to me. With all that being said, I have it in B tier because it is very stock. Not stock in the sense that it's bad, but it is very much just what you see is what you get. And it does have a charm to it, being that it's, super cool, gnarly, underground 80s death metal. But as their albums would go on, they would develop musically, and I think they would do more interesting stuff. Out of all the albums from the early era of Death, this album I think has the most charm. And of course, the album cover is iconic. Ed Repka, who's very famous for working with Megadeth, did it, and I love the 1950s horror comic vibe that it has going for it. If you want just a straight death metal album, I can totally understand why this one would be your favorite, but for me, it's just in B tier. With that being said, their second album, Leprosy, which came out in 1988, is probably going to go down in C for me. This is the first album where Chuck doesn't have to do everything by himself except play drums. Rick Rozz is on guitar with Bill Andrews on drums. I think Chuck still played the bass though. And there's a lot of great riffs on this album, obviously. There's great riffs on all the Death albums, and it is still solid. I particularly love Forgotten Past and the ending track, Choke on It. I also should theoretically really like that it only has 8 songs, because for me, I usually like albums that are shorter and only have 7, 8, 9 songs. I think it gives each song a chance to stand out more. The reason I have it below Scream Bloody Gore is because although Leprosy is good, one of the albums has to be my least favorite, and this is kind of just the album that is the least memorable to me. That's not to say that there aren't good songs on it, like Pull the Plug or Choke on It, Open Casket. There's a lot of great riffs on this album, but it is the one that I've listened to the least. I also do want to say that although I'm putting this album down in C, that doesn't mean I think it's bad. And the album artwork is probably my favorite Ed Repka artwork that he did outside of the stuff he did with Megadeth. Okay, and coming up next, this might be another controversial opinion from me, but coming in with their third album, Spiritual Healing from 1990, the last album artwork that Ed Repka did, I'm going to put it up in A tier. I feel like I might have just pissed off some people with that, but hear me out. For me, this album is really, really good, and I think it's the best version of that early Death sound, while still hinting at where they would go in the future, being a bit more technical. It's the same lineup from Leprosy, except James Murphy has replaced Rick Rozz on guitar. I think it's the first time that Death had production that really captured what the band was all about. I do think out of the first 3 albums that Spiritual Healing is the best sonically sounding one. I think Chuck's vocals also sound the most brutal on this album compared to the first 2. That's not to say they weren't good on the first 2, but I think he's starting to kind of come into his own on this one. And his album is also hinting at the technical death metal direction they would go in, but it's not quite there. They still have some slowed down halftime riffs that kind of feel reminiscent of Black Sabbath. And this album, Spiritual Healing, to me sounds like it's a natural progression from the first two albums. You have this incredible off-kilter riff with the title track, and the lyrics are some of Chuck's darkest. I love the line, "All the prayers in the world can't help you now." Fucking metal. The lyrics are also starting to evolve in a way that I really like. They're a bit more grounded. They're focused on real-world issues. I think it makes the subjects that they're talking about scarier. Chuck hasn't gotten to the point where he's very subtle and kind of just has a subdued, quiet, ominous style in his lyrics yet, but he's starting to head in that direction. And for me, I prefer that to the over-the-top, gory lyrics of the first two albums. Bill Andrews' drumming also sounds much more confident on this album than it did on Leprosy. There's so many great musical moments here in this whole album. I really love Spiritual Healing. And I think it's kind of underrated. I think that it's usually seen as one of their lesser albums, but like I said, I think it's kind of the peak of their early years. I don't know if you'll agree with me on that, but hey, that's my opinion. And another incredible album is 1991's Human, which... am I going to put it in B? No, you know what? I'll put it up in A tier. This is another incredible album that for some reason I don't love as much as I feel like I should, even though I think that in every way this album is just a level up from the previous three. It's an entirely new lineup this time, and I just think that the musicianship on Human is the best by far that this band had put out up to that point. The guitar tone is different, the solos and the riffs are over the top. It's the only album with Sean Reinhart on drums, and he is just next fucking level. No disrespect to the previous drummers, but my god, listen to songs like Flattening of Emotions and Lack of Comprehension. He was an absolute monster on that drum kit, and he recently passed away like 3 or 4 years ago, so rest in peace. See Through Dreams is another track with just a unbelievable drum performance. I'll put Human just below Spiritual Healing because even though I like the style that Death is playing with on this album more than I like the style of their early albums, there's just something about Spiritual Healing where the songs stick with me more. It's really close, so I don't know. That might change in the future, honestly. I'll put it above Spiritual Healing because, my god, Flattening of Emotions. They also have a really great cover of God of Thunder, and if you can make me rock out to a Kiss song, then you're doing a really good job. So, yeah, Human up in A tier, ahead of Spiritual Healing. Okay, and coming up next is Individual Thought Patterns from 1993, and we have our first S tier, because I fucking love this album. This album is outstanding, and for me, it's a masterpiece. There's a lot of reasons why this album stands out to me, 2 of them being Gene Hoglan's drumming and Andy LaRocque's guitar solos. Add in that Chuck just came up with some really good songs, and the bass playing on this album is absolutely incredible. Every song is a 10 out of 10. Gene Hoglan's drums are so intense, but also sound so incredibly relaxed and are mixed perfectly. Sometimes with super fast double bass pedals, they can kind of sound like a typewriter, or they can be too boomy in the mix, and this album has it mixed just right. Also, Andy LaRocque's solos are so incredible. It's the first time that Death has such a big contrast between the guitar players. On their early albums, it's like one solo would play, another solo would play, and they would all sound like it could be from the same guitar player. But with this album, you hear Andy playing and you hear Chuck playing, and there's no confusion as to who's playing what. It's the first time that Death had that contrast in the guitar solos, kind of like Megadeth, where there's no confusing Dave Mustaine or Marty Friedman when they're playing a solo, and that's something that I really love about this album. And the funny thing about this album and what makes it so good is that Andy LaRocque's guitar solos almost sound like they shouldn't be in Death. They almost don't even fit, but somehow it still works. And you can tell that Chuck was taking some influence from Andy's solos as well, because I think he has some of his best work on this album from a lead perspective. The solos on Trapped in a Corner are probably my favorite instrumental passage in any Death song. You have songs like the title track and The Philosopher, Jealousy, and Overactive Imagination. This album is super melodic, and at times it almost feels like it's a power metal album, or it's like bordering on that, so I can understand why someone who just wants straight death metal might not like this album, but the more I listen to it, the better it gets, and Individual Thought Patterns is just incredible for me, and I have no hesitation putting it up in S tier. And coming up next, we have another album that is basically perfect, 1995 Symbolic. And for me, I'm going to put it at the very top of A tier, almost S. Chuck's lyrics on this album are so scary, but also so subdued. The guitar tone has a bit more bite to it than Individual Thought Patterns, and even though Andy LaRocque isn't on this one, you can still hear the influence he had on Chuck with his solos, because Chuck, once again, is just on another level on this album. I mean, this album has so many bangers. You have Crystal Mountain, Zero Tolerance, Misanthrope, Perennial Quest, Empty Words, the title track. I mean, those are probably my favorites, so basically the entire album. Gene Hoglan is once again killing it on drums, and I particularly love the beat he does at the end of Symbolic. It kind of fades out. The only reason I'm putting Symbolic down in A tier and not S is because it just doesn't have that extra level of emotional attachment the way Individual Thought Patterns does for me. If you have Symbolic as your favorite Death album, you're not going to get any argument from me against it. It's one of my favorites. It's just that when you have a band that has a discography this good, it is kind of like splitting hairs after a while where you're like, I don't know, I'll put Individual Thought Patterns up here because I just really love it for some reason. And all of these are really good, but this album grabs me more. With all that, we come now to The Sound of Perseverance, and I don't know if people will get mad at me for this, but I'm putting it up in S tier. I know that this is one of Death's best albums, and a lot of people say it's their favorite, but I also know that some people think it's overrated. For me, it's as good as people say it is. I mean, this is the album that got me into Death, so if it wasn't for The Sound of Perseverance, I wouldn't have listened to all these other albums as much as I have. And to me, this album also has a perfect flow. You'll start off with a longer song and then go to a shorter, more straightforward one. You have a song like The Voice of the Soul to kind of lull you into a false sense of security, and then you get your mind blown with the drum intro of To Forgive Is to Suffer. Speaking of drums, Gene Hoglan is not on this album, it's Richard Christy, and his drumming on this album is so chaotic. It might not be as technical or as controlled or relaxed as Gene Hoglan's, but it has this raw, unhinged quality to the performance that it feels like the entire album is about to explode at the seams or just fall apart because he's barely holding it together, but somehow it still works. Another thing I love about The Sound of Perseverance is that each song feels very unique, and you don't get the sense that they're too similar. As much as I love the first album, and even some of the other albums, there's sometimes where it's like, these songs do sound very much alike. I don't think that The Sound of Perseverance has that problem. Chuck blends all his influences on this album. You can hear traces of everything from Merciful Fate to jazz and Venom to Megadeth. Some people don't like Chuck's cleaner vocals on this album, and I don't mind because I actually really like that he gets to show off how good of a melodic singer he can be, especially on the cover of Painkiller, where it's obvious that he is just having a ton of fun with those vocals. And I think that for this album, having a more screeching tone and a less brutal, sort of typical death metal approach suits the songs. It's so difficult for me to pick a favorite song on this album because they're all so perfect. I have to mention Voice of the Soul because it is such a beautiful instrumental song. It actually kind of reminds me a little bit of To One Far Away by Merciful Fate, and it just shows how talented of a musician Chuck was, and how even though he gave us all these albums, he still had so much more he could have given us and so many more styles he could have played around with. Scavenger of Human Sorrow is so vicious, and the riff in Bite the Pain that starts around 40 seconds in, the is some of the chunkiest guitar tone I've ever heard in my fucking life. It is so biting and so just like shrieking while also being very punchy. It is some of the best guitar tone that you can ever hear on any metal album. And even though it might be cliche to say that The Sound of Perseverance is my favorite Death album, I completely stand by it. It is an unbelievable masterpiece, and for a last album, I think Chuck just knocked it out of the park. Rest in peace, Chuck. Thank you so much for all this incredible music. But enough about what I think. What do you think about Death, and how would you rank their studio albums? What would you have down at the bottom? What would you have up in the top? Let me know in the comments below. I'm sure there's a lot of people who disagree with my ranking, and that's totally cool. If you have a different opinion than me, I want to hear it. Just don't be a dick about it. Most of you are super awesome, but this is the internet, so I always have to toss that disclaimer out. If you like this video, I'm sure there's a recommendation for another video popping up somewhere around here right now. And like always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you at the next video.